Good morning, everyone, and welcome to panel P07a. This is the first of two panels on remote research methods, titled How Can Remote Research Methods Contribute to Field Research in the Developing World, Producing Development Knowledge from a Distance. In addition to this panel session, we will have another session on remote research methods taking place tomorrow at the same time at 10 a.m. UK time. So please be sure to check that out as well. My name is Joanna Octavia, doctoral researcher at the Warwick Institute for Employment Research and the convener of this panel. This morning, we have a total of 4 exciting presentations on research that was conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic in 4 different countries. 3 presentations feature methodological reflections on conducting mobile phone surveys in Bangladesh, India, as well as Ghana. We also have 1 presentation on traditional and social media data analysis, as well as interviews that were conducted remotely with research participants in Kenya. So the variety of methods used would hope we hope that would lead to a very exciting discussion later on. Several housekeeping notices before we start. As an experimental panel, this panel required all presenters to submit a pre-recorded video presentation, which we will play at this time. Live Q&A and discussion with the panel speakers will take place after all the presentations have been played. In the meantime, please do send your questions to the chat, indicating clearly the speaker or the presentation that you are addressing. Please also note that this panel will be recorded and that the recording will be made available on the DSA conference website under panel P07a. So without further ado, we will start with the first paper, finding out fast about the impact of COVID-19, the need for policy-relevant methodological innovation. This paper focuses on how phone surveys done in Bangladesh can be used to find out fast during the pandemic, generating rapid insights on the impacts of COVID-19 and resulting in significant policy influence. This paper is authored jointly by Imran Mateen from Brack University in Bangladesh, David Hume from the University of Manchester, Nicola Banks from the University of Manchester, as well as Hossein Zilur Rahman, Power and Participation Research Center.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicola Banks from the University of Manchester.
Hi, good morning. My name is Imran Mateen. I'm from Brack Institute of Governance and Development.
Good morning. I'm David Hume from the University of Manchester.
So together today, we're going to talk through a paper we had published recently about why it's so important to find out fast in contexts like today, and the methodologies that Brack University and the Power and Participation Research Center have done in Bangladesh. So perhaps, David, you could start by telling us a bit about what kinds of methodologies were used for finding out fast before COVID-19.
Yeah, the methodologies before COVID-19 that we tend to the earlier ones in development studies had started with rapid rural appraisal, which was particularly pushed by Robert Chambers and developed by colleagues at IDS at Sussex. And that looked for ways of rapidly generating information about what was happening, usually on agricultural and rural development programs in Asia and Africa. That looked at the way that rather than having formal surveys, you could use administrative data, the sort of management information system of a program or a project. It looked at the way that you could use informal conversations particularly with the beneficiaries or targeted beneficiaries of programs to find out what was happening with them. And how you could also use key informants to check what you were finding out, so you could work out what you thought the story was about what was happening, but get people issue about whether that analysis was correct or not. It was very good in terms of it being fast. A problem that it faced, though, one of the major problems was it tended to be pretty much entirely qualitative. the size of samples and the types of data weren't quantitative. So it was sometimes quite hard to judge what the actual distributions within a population would be. Some people might tell you about the problems they'd had with a particular project or program. Others might tell you about the benefits. But actually working out what the numbers of people were was quite difficult. I mean, from that, things moved on, particularly to participation, arguing that those involved in programs, that in a way, what we used to call the beneficiaries or the target beneficiaries of programs going back into the 1980s and 1990s, that their voice needed to be heard. And that was quite a methodological shift in that, rather than in a way asking questions and recording answers, it asked people to talk through what was happening on programs and projects so that they could actually use their own concepts and in a way answer the questions that they thought were important, rather than answering the questions which an external researcher thought were important. And there was a whole raft of those approaches in the 1990s, which led to major agencies like the World Bank beginning to use participatory approaches.
Good. So Imran, by last year, COVID-19 hit. Could you tell us how PPRC and BIGD came together to respond with the research that you rolled out?
Yeah, great, thanks. So PPRC and BIGD. PPRC is both are Bangladeshi research institutions. Both are led by Bangladeshi researchers, and both are totally, kind of very, very committed social science research organizations. So that's the first thing. I think right at when sort of COVID, when early March, by late March, when the first movement restriction happened in Bangladesh, I mean, there was an article that the executive chair of PPRC wrote in the National Daily, on the COVID effects, what the priority should be, and the sort of the policy agenda setting type of a newspaper piece. I remember, calling him up and basically, kind of saying, look, I mean, it's sort of great that you are kind of making this policy recommendation, but we really need to get a very strong monitoring oriented evidence base behind this to be able to really get much greater traction. And what BIGD could offer is that we had large national surveys, large scale national surveys, where we had phone contact database, and we could. That's what we could basically offer. That's a sample frame of sort of national level that we could basically use. We had the kind of the implementation infrastructure to be quickly able to do these phone surveys. And what PPRC had, of course, is very deep policy agenda setting experience. And we quickly sort of realized that if we can harness these two muscles together, we would develop some new muscles and sort of really be able to, kind of create a synergy of being able to really, you say something useful for COVID related policy agenda discussion, right? And we were always very clear that, getting straight into policy decisions is a long battle. What is really important is to work with the policy environment. So we were very clear that we wanted to basically set the tone in the policy environment that is based on good, credible, rapid research. So that's what we really wanted to basically set. So we wanted to in many ways step up the overall quality of the discussion that was really happening with respect to what should be done. And I think that was really our sort of, I think, deepest focus.
Fantastic. And the survey itself was very ambitious. It was large scale, about thousands. Was it 12,500 households or thereabouts?
Yeah. So it was basically a sample of about 7,000 sort of households, and we had a 3-round survey. And I mean, the other very important thing here is that we were very clear that we will have some modules that we're going to repeat, but we're going to be nimble. That every round we would think about what are the emerging issues, what is the issue that needs to be focused right now. So we had an element of continuity, but that we were very, very sharp about that to ensure that it doesn't balloon up. And then we always had a space to be responsive. And I think that was really, really important. And all of that within the boundary condition of phone survey, which should not be more than 30 to maximum 40 minutes. So that required huge discipline. It required both Zilurbai and myself to really, kind of work very closely with our team members, and several iterations of discussion. I mean, both of us with our team and, Zilurbai would basically get other experts in to provide, expert inputs into the conversation. And each of these survey designs took, 7 to 10 iterative conversations where both Zilurbai and I would basically be involved. And I think that level of commitment was extremely important for us to be able to drive this forward.
Right. And unfortunately, we don't have time to look in great detail at the findings, but I think there were a couple of them that would be great to hear from you, the key insights that the survey raised and why it was so important to find out fast in the way that PPRC and BID did. So
I think the, so there are 3 that I'll basically perhaps highlight, or maybe 4. So the first one is this insight on new poor. And the sort of, this wouldn't come as a surprise to, people like, so David, who's worked so much on sort of poverty dynamics. So this is, there's always new poor, and there's always, sort of poverty dynamics. But we really looked at during COVID period, those who were above the poverty line, but below the median income. So we basically said, these are the vulnerable non-poor. Of them, what is happening to this group? So we really kind of locked in our focus on this new poor. And, I mean, over time, what's happening to them? Are they being able to escape? Are they getting trapped? And sort of all of that. So I think that really was really important in terms of drawing attention in terms of the new poor. The second is, I think we sort of focused quite a bit in terms of the urban dimension. It was very clear that the effect was very urban, and the recovery was much less robust in the urban area for the urban poor compared to rural areas. So I think the importance of focusing on the urban and the need to look at urban social protection with far greater energy and creativity is an agenda that we really, really focused on here. And the third one is something we focused on in the last round of the survey that we did, which is on looking at education life of children during this time and what was happening, what children were doing. And we came up with this, kind of concept of learning loss risk. We looked at, children who were either not studying, or children who were just doing, kind of self-study without any supervision from anywhere, any support, is very likely to be a big learning loss. And sort of also children who were, kind of studying but very irregularly. So we combined these 3 in with an analytical framework and talked about learning loss. And we quantified all of this, and which was then picked up by media to create a bit of kind of urgency and traction on this.
Okay, and those findings have all been very powerful. And again, the speed there has been so important, with the government stepping in because of the credibility of your survey to design new packages of support for both the urban poor and the new poor, and now around for children, which is incredible. And without that speed, the length of time those households would have been in crisis would have been much longer. So I think that's so important and amazing. So I think the last thing that we wanted to touch upon before finishing was what other research projects can learn from PPRC and BIDD's rapid research initiative. David, you were going to talk to us a little bit about the idea of using the new technology of telephones for research.
Yeah, I think certainly what this research has illustrated is just the use and the incredible potential that using telephones and particularly mobiles has. I mean, I think for me that was quite a finding, partly because I'm a technophobe, but also because commonly telephone surveys have been something that is done for polling or for the media, but not for substantive academic research or for policy research. But I think this exercise shows that one can use them for very serious research. It's important in a way that one has a sampling frame, otherwise you don't know who you're getting in touch with, and certainly constructing sampling frames so that in the case of an emergency or just for rapid survey results in the future, we know that we've roughly got the structure of the population and that the actual sort of sampling frame has been thought through. I think we've also seen that a relationship is good. If people have been part of a previous survey, if they know the organization that is doing the survey work, then it doesn't feel like a random phone call. It is actually someone who you've heard of, perhaps someone who you've got trust in. And obviously PPRC and particularly the BRAC brand helped with that. I think we also need to note that there is a danger that one would be, in a way, omitting certain groups, and particularly very poor groups who haven't got access to mobiles. But that's certainly partly been overcome in this study by working with feature phones, by not working with smartphones automatically, but working with much lower cost phones, which are certainly in Bangladesh very widespread. And also by saying to people who are being interviewed, if you haven't got a phone, or if your phone is broken or not charged at the time, then let us know. Neighbours, let us contact you through somebody else's telephone. I don't think we claim that the ultra poor are totally captured by this, but it is possible to take these sort of mitigation measures to make sure that you're getting pretty deep down into the population. And even high cost survey methods find it pretty hard to get right down to the bottom of the sort of socioeconomic pyramid. And the final thing is, certainly further work is required on this to try and return and find out if there is a bias in the sample, so that we can begin to think about how we interpret the results even more carefully. We certainly need to look at rates of attrition, whether rates of attrition are different for different parts of the population, so that by the third or fourth wave, whether we're actually working with a somewhat difficult frame. But I have to say that as a technophobe, I've been incredibly impressed with what can be achieved in a very low cost way through mobile phones.
Yeah. And I think the second important message, reflecting back on how David started around what rapid research has been to date, is that this initiative really kind of signifies a quantitative turn in rapid research. Generally, those haven't gone together because there's so much more infrastructure and time required in quantitative surveys if you don't have the frames that BIG did to use that. So rapid research was always small sample sizes and qualitative methods. But I think the strength of your findings and the strength of the policy impact that you've had is because it's been quantitative. You used the term quite powerfully, it was credible, it was quantifiable, and to be able to bring those statistics and show them to policymakers is so incredibly important. Whether a small sample frame and more subjective measures of those crises was as powerful a tool in that respect, I don't think it would have been. And then Imran, you were going to talk about policy engagement and how that was so central to taking your findings to action as well, I think.
Yeah, so as I said right at the beginning, I mean, I think we were very sort of clear in terms of our policy engagement or policy influence and vision. Of course, we wanted policymakers to listen, and we invited them. They were part of, the different dissemination events that we basically did. But for us, the more important thing was to really work to really lift up the evidence base of the policy conversation that was basically happening, right? And I think it was not only what we did, but because of the lifting up that we did, there were lots of other work that was happening, supplementary, complementary work done by NGOs and other organizations. All of that came together, and there was a kind of almost like a body of sort of evidence, which I think then the policymakers, had to pay attention to, right? So I think our work was much more, not so much directly, for the policymakers. Of course, we involved them, but it was more to lift up, the bar, if you like, or the standards of the conversation, and then of course, sort of, kind of creating that ripple effect for sort of others to basically come in and sort of work and make that influence. So that basically happened. I think there was, I remember our first survey that we did. We tried to estimate based on, because we asked people about, those who are new poor and those who are in sort of poverty, in terms of what is the support they would need, and we sort of analytically use that measure to estimate what would be the total amount of support that would be basically required. And at the same time, we had another big work, policy level work, that Professor S.R. Osmani was basically doing in terms of review of the stimulus package and what type of stimulus package should be put in place. And I think both of those together, I think, came up with this kind of figure of, we basically said about 3,000 to 3,500 taka per person. We obviously had a much greater number of people that it should be provided to, but I think that the amount was basically accepted by the government. But obviously the extent of support was much less than what we had asked for, and that's sort of primarily, and that's what we picked up in the second round of the survey. That was primarily because the delivery mechanisms were not there. So one of the biggest challenge for the government to actually be able to kind of provide all this support was also because of lack of delivery mechanism being in place. And I think especially in the urban sector, and that was, one of the big challenges. And that's why, we sort of argued for not a target-oriented approach, but a kind of open market sale of essential commodities at a much lower price, as a mechanism of sort of providing immediate relief support. So yeah, I think those are some of the ways we basically try to move the discussion. On the learning loss, I think this is still, still something that we are trying to work on. One of the things that we want to do right now is these three areas that I just now mentioned. The urban social protection area, the area of learning loss, and the third area actually I didn't talk about is the cottage and small micro enterprise. How do we revive this sector? Because most of the new poor are basically people who used to be either employed or employees of this cottage and micro and small enterprise sector, which is primarily urban and very urban. So on these three topics, we are now going to hold, kind of more policy-oriented conversation. So until now, we've been disseminating our research results. Now we want to really have focused policy conversation. We're going to bring in not only Bangladeshi experts, but global experts as well, who are working in the interface between policy, research, and academia, to be able to really tell us what type of interventions are going to be, can work in this context based on global evidence and things like that. So that's something we will be doing in the next month or so.
Great. So then briefly, just to finish off, I think another important message to leave our viewers with is the importance of new forms of Southern leadership and partnerships, and how we can best orient those to support each other as we go through these initiatives in the future. If anyone wants to comment upon that.
Well, from the north, I'll make the initial maybe point on that. And I think at the present time, we are looking at decolonizing our research methods, our research approaches, and our our teaching. And certainly those in the North need not to see this as the North being pushed out, but it is for Northern research partners to take appropriate roles where they have some form of comparative advantage and can work together. And certainly it's the relationship that we've been able to have with BIGD, with PPRC, with our colleagues in Bangladesh. And I think the trust that goes on both sides on that relationship, that one will work together on the program, one will reach the conclusions and publish together. I think that's worked very effectively for us. That means developing long-term relationships. I was just doing the sums now, Imran. It's 25 years since you finished your PhD off, and we had a cup of tea together, and you said you'd be interested if we could work together, and we've managed that over the 25 years. But those sorts of long-term relationships really make it much easier to work because we're both busy people, but we can trust each other. If we don't get time to look at it, we can trust each other to take it forward without any problems. I think it's really important because it does create this sort of inclusive approach in which all of the partners can contribute. And I think that's good. I mean, I think Imran, when he was talking about the policy lobbying, was talking about the national conversation and the national democratic processes. But this does help to take us towards a more internationally inclusive and democratic world in which these conversations are not controlled by either side. People can contribute to them. So yeah, we found this very rewarding, and we certainly recommend these forms of partnership. Maybe I'm exaggerating, Imran.
No, I mean, yeah, no, I mean, I don't think you are. I mean, I think just to add on this kind of, global partnership idea. I mean, I think what COVID has in many ways done, and this type of crisis do that, and this crisis is sort of, everybody said, become such a hackneyed term that this is unprecedented. Of course it is, but I think what it has done is it has really focused minds. And that's something we've really observed in case of Bangladesh, right? I mean, the reason PPRC BIGD came together is because, our mind was focused on this national need, and there was this crisis, and we wanted to do something. We wanted to be relevant, and that, that struggle for relevance and that focusing of mind, and it was amazing. Not only the PPRC BIGD work, but whoever we wanted to bring on board, in Bangladesh, or Bangladesh is abroad, even the diaspora, the academic Bangladeshi diaspora. I've never seen them as engaged or as sort of ready to be part of this kind of larger initiative, to try and really be relevant and sort of contribute. And I think this energy needs to be harnessed. I think in terms of creating new types of epistemic, partnerships. And I think there is something there. This needs some thinking. I think how do we harness this? How do we take it to the next level? I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities and promise and possibilities there that we should take seriously.
That's a nice way to end. COVID may have closed economies, it might have closed borders, but it has definitely not closed minds, and it has not closed partnerships, no matter where they are in the world. So from Dhaka and from Manchester, thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow, thank you so much, Nicola, Imran, and David, for that amazing presentation. Really learned a lot about finding out fast, but not just that, to also work fast during the pandemic to get the data that the government needs to design these policy packages. If you have questions for David, Nicola, or Imran, do put your questions in the chat and keep the questions coming through the chat box. We'll keep an eye on them, and they will be addressed at the end of the session during the live Q&A. You'll also have the chance to ask your questions yourselves during the live Q&A at the end. So moving forward, in the second presentation, we will move from Bangladesh to India, and we have a presentation by Kavita Kasala from the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, Padmaja Ravula from ICRI SAT, as well as Nadumaran Swamikanu from ICRI SAT. This presentation also looks at how a mobile phone survey was conducted to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the food security at the household level in urban and peri-urban environments.
Greetings, my name is Kavita Kasala and I am from the organization called ICRISAT. I am presenting this study along with my co-authors Dr. Padmaja and Dr. Nedumaran. I'll be talking about the insights and challenges encountered using the remote data collection for one of our projects during the pandemic. Introducing ICRISAT, that is International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. The mission is to help empower 600 million poor people to overcome hunger, poverty, and a degraded environment in the dry tropics through better agriculture. ICRISAT is supported by the Consultative Group on International Agriculture Research, that is CGIAR. ICRISAT envisions a prosperous, food secure, and resilient dryland tropics. The ICRISAT mandate crops are chickpea, groundnut, sorghum, pigeon pea, pearl millet, and finger millet. The overall goal of ICRISAT is to mobilize with partners cutting-edge science and institutional innovations for poverty alleviation, food security, human development, and environmental protection for poor rural families in semi-arid production systems of Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Coming to the outline of my presentation is as follows, with the introduction to the project, introduction to the survey modules, followed by data and methods, results, and finally, conclusion. While over the past 2 decades, considerable literature has accumulated on the problems associated with rapid urbanization in developing countries, the literature has largely ignored urban food systems and how they link production and consumption networks at local, regional, and global levels. Similarly, the vast literature on global food systems rarely addresses the contextual role of urbanization. It has now become imperative to more deeply and systematically understand and address the issues and needs arising from the shifting geographies of the food system, considering the supply and demand dimensions of urban and peri-urban areas as critical components of the global rural-urban transformation phenomenon. This project, titled The Dynamics of Urban Sprawl, Land Use Changes, Food Supply and Sustainable Agricultural Production System in Arid and Semi-Arid Zones in India, attempts to fuse food security and malnutrition to highlight issues critical to future research programs so that improved diets become accessible to all urban dwellers. The overall objective of this project is to analyze the adaptation of urban food systems to urban sprawl stress. Keeping in mind this objective, the data collection was done to understand food and nutrition security in the selected locations as well as to ascertain the impact of sprawl on the ability to feed future populations' needs. The project also examines how food supply and agricultural production systems adapt and relate to land use as well as urban sprawl. The emphasis of the research is on nutrition transition, land use changes, epidemiological changes, and the socioeconomic status of the research participants residing in urban and peri-urban areas in and around Hyderabad, Telangana, India. As you see, the project is funded by Swedish Research Council for Environment, Agricultural Sciences and Spatial Planning, and the primary collaborators are ICRISAT and Swedish Agricultural University. Moving on to the data collection under the specific topic of COVID-19, as you all know that the pandemic undermines food security both directly and indirectly. To understand the impact of COVID-19 on food security at the household level in urban and peri-urban environments, the study was conducted remotely using telephonic surveys. Here, the remote data collection was a method of collecting offline interviewer-driven Illume surveys in environments in which obtaining an internet connection was difficult or impossible. Moving on to the data and methods. The study was designed such that we are going to build a longitudinal panel of data every half yearly over 3 years so that we can identify the status, the causes or implications of urbanization on food and nutrition security. Following this, the GIS remote sensing analysis by GIS scientists identified 4 quadrants or grids. 2 grids are in peri-urban or rural urban locations and 2 grids of urban locations. For the formation of these grids, the population data for each of these bundles was collected from the District Census Handbook 2011 of India for each of the districts, and the proportion of geographic area of each mandal contributing to each grid was calculated, and thereby the mandal level population in the grid was made proportional to its geographical area in the grid, and the sampling was finalized. As per the table below, the data was collected from the blue highlighted locations. Moving on, there were 14 randomly selected locations for the study, out of which 10 locations were situated in the peri-urban areas and 4 locations were in the urban areas, covering about 565 sample households. So as you see, there is a shift from physical interviews to remote data collection during the 4th round. Here we observe that the number of modules for data collection are reduced in the round 4. The objective of the survey during 4th round was to understand and quantify the extent of impact on the livelihoods and earnings and overall food security of urban and peri-urban locations in India. Following a set of questions on the demographic profile of the respondents and their households, such as age, gender, education, region, main source of income, and household size, the survey instrument was divided into 3 broad sections. The first section surveyed respondents' primary work activity and earnings prior to the lockdown. The month of February 2020 was used to document these baseline estimates. The section then surveys the work and earnings of the respondent during the period of lockdown, beginning from March 24, 2020 till the date of the survey. A comparison of the work and earnings estimates over these 2 periods allows us to identify the impact of lockdown on employment and earnings. The second section of the questionnaire examines the household level impacts, including health, financial security, and to what extent the existing social security nets helped mitigate the impact of the crisis. Finally, the last section of the survey explores food precarity of the households. On an average, each survey was estimated to take about 15 minutes to administer through telephonic survey. As you see, the data was collected in the tablets running on KoboTool. KoboTool software is a free software used for collecting the data in surveys. The questionnaire was incorporated into the software in the form of a program that runs on any Android-powered devices like mobile phones and tablets. The questions were displayed on the tablets with options and drop-downs. Data collection for the whole survey was digital in nature, and the data collected was supervised by the concerned supervisors at the ICRISAT headquarters. Here is a pictorial representation of the transition from physical to remote method of data collection. Here, the major responsibility falls onto the enumerator in handling the data collection through online mode in the absence of physical presence and the much needed emotions. Remote collection of data may also require greater effort on the part of the study participant, who may also be required to use their own phone, their own resources to charge their phone, and also to identify a private space to participate in the study. The training is an integral part of any data collection, and more so in remote data collection. A 3-day online training, including pilot, was organized to build the capacity of the enumerators to do the data collection using the mobile phone. Pre-existing rapport through past surveying in the earlier 3 rounds made the data collection possible during the pandemic. The data was collected with the help of the same enumerators who were a part of the earlier rounds for building the trust and ensuring the receipt of quality data from the sample. Rigorous role plays and pilot surveys conducted and evaluated as a part of the training. Also, institutional affiliation makes a difference, and ICRISAT, as a pioneering institute in agricultural research in semi-arid tropics, was well known among the participants. In addition, ethical audio consent was taken before the start of the survey, and the details of the survey were explained to the participants. In spite of rigorous follow-up during the pandemic, The field team could reach about to approximately around 50% of the original sample under the telephonic survey. From the figure, it was observed that the non-response rates were higher across the locations, even though the phone was working, followed by the out of service, invalid numbers, or not in coverage area, or switched off mobile numbers. Very few participants declined midway into the interviews because of pre-existing relationships. In spite of repeated calls, the interviews could not be completed. This may be attributed to the stress that the participant might be undergoing due to the pandemic and thereby his or her inability to participate in the completion of the telephonic survey. When you see the response from the peri-urban and urban participants, the response rate is found to be slightly higher in peri-urban locations than urban locations. And this may be attributed to the pandemic once again. In the absence of pandemic, maybe the response rate would have been higher. And interestingly, the percentage of switched off mobile phones was mostly similar in both the locations. Finally, to come to the conclusions from this survey, the phone surveys actually require shorter, simpler instruments to ensure quality and reduce fatigue. The survey time here in this survey was not extended because of the questionnaire, but the respondent queries were much higher than the actual interview of the survey questionnaire. Also to note that there were a lot of passive refusals stating that they were busy, call later, bad timing, and when called again, they did not respond to the call rings. We should also note that some participants who cooperated in the beginning of the interview and agreed to participate in the survey failed to complete the survey and hung up their phone in the middle of the interview. Returning the calls resulted in a non-response. Survey through mobile phones was also difficult as the participants switched during the middle of the interview. The enumerators had tough time convincing the earlier or previous participants to respond to the interview or had to restart the whole interview for the new participant in the same household once again. Finally, women rarely participated in the remote survey due to lack of accessibility to own mobile phones and existing social norms. To conclude, on one hand, remote methods may be more preferable to study participants, removing the time and opportunity cost associated with travel to study sites. Remote data collection also provides an opportunity for more efficient data collection, being less expensive and time consuming than face-to-face data collection for the researchers. The telephonic or mobile survey may be preferred by some study participants who may also have more time for participation, particularly during lockdowns. A key challenge requiring further research and navigation is how to involve individuals, especially women in the study who do not own the mobile devices and have limited access to the mobile devices within the household. And once again, training is the key to develop rapport with participants over the phone, including role play practice of interviews, especially on how to set the tone at the beginning of the interview with informal conversation. And above all, perseverance is required to repeatedly call participants at different times of day and days of the week and call back if the interview is disturbed or cut out. Despite the limitations, remote methods can be more efficient than face-to-face data collection in a COVID-19 era and provide platforms to empower individuals to engage in generating and analyzing the data. With this, I end my presentation and thank you one and all for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kavitha, for the presentation. That was really informative, and I was definitely taking notes. I think it really shed a light on the opportunities and challenges provided by mobile phone surveys at a time of crisis like COVID-19, where close contact was not is not available, is not possible. But we also hear about the importance of perseverance and just really trying to get to the respondents that we're hoping to survey or interview. And I think that's one key takeaway from this presentation. And moving on to the third presentation, the third paper in the session reflects on the use of respondent-driven sampling using mobile phones as well for a multi-method research project on masculinities and sexual and reproductive health in Ghana conducted during COVID-19. This paper is authored by researchers from both the UK and Ghana, Joe Strong, PhD candidate from the London School of Economics and Political Science, in collaboration with Ni Lamte Samuel Lamte, Ni Kwartle Karti, and Ni Kwarte Richie Uru. And if the audience have questions for Kavita from the previous presentation, please drop them in the chat as well. And they will be addressed during the live Q&A at the end of the session. Just wanted to check if everyone is okay IT-wise before I start the third presentation. All clear? Great.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining me, and welcome to my pre-recorded talk. Pre-recorded even better, because then you can pause it to laugh at all my amazing jokes that are coming later on. Thank you so much, first of all, to DSA for putting on this conference and putting in so much hard work, and obviously putting together this panel and all the amazing presenters as well. I'm Joe Strong, and today I'm going to be presenting on behalf of my research team, which includes Ni Lamte Samuel Lamte, Ni Kwartle Kwarte, and Ni Kwarte Richard Owu. And we will be presenting on masculinities and methodologies, unsettling quantitative methods in response to COVID-19. And this is a presentation that's drawing both on the desire to unsettle some of the assumptions that we have in quantitative research as part of this PhD project, but also actually how the response to COVID-19 and the change in methodologies interacted with that initial desire for unsettling those assumptions. And so really quickly, I just want to make sure that I'm giving thanks and due credit to some of the extremely important individuals and organizations who have facilitated this. My colleagues and supervisors at the London School of Economics, Professor Ernestina Coast, Dr. Tiziana Leone, and Dr. Rashida Nandagiri, as well as my supervisor in Ghana at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, Professor Ismail Tupiri, Act for Change, which is an organization that operates within Jamestown in Accra, who really helped facilitate and support this research, and of course, the Economic and Social Research Council, my funders. So this PhD project was really trying to explore the roles and relationships of men in abortion and emergency contraception pathways, trying to really uncover how men can shape the conditions under which women and pregnant people seek care. And it's really about understanding how men and what men do and why they do it, to try and give us a more complete picture of the context and the realities around reproductive autonomy and agency. And for more information, you can either visit our project website, masculinityproject.org, or there's also, there's also our BMJ Open research protocol, which is published open access. And so in particular, one of the things that this project really aimed to do was to delineate and destabilize this notion of men as partners. And it's something that comes up in a lot of policy discourse and a lot of program discourse. And it's about engaging men as partners to women with regards to sexual and reproductive health. For example, around decision-making of contraceptive use. And what this research aimed to do was to think, what happens if we think beyond just men as partners? And think about this idea of masculinities, the constructions of manhood, which are based on relations, not just the relation to a partner, but also between men and with other people and the community itself. Really trying to open up this beyond the interpersonal. And because this is quite an exploratory approach to see whether masculinities can really help us understand better sexual and reproductive health and rights, there was a triangulated nested design that used mixed methods, a quantitative survey, focus group discussions, and in-depth interviews. And today I'm really going to hone in on the quantitative survey element of this. So in designing this, in trying to really unsettle some of the assumptions, it's first really important to recognize what they are. And what we see often in global harmonized data sets, so for example, the demographic and health survey, is that men are only really incorporated as partners. And in fact, in most global surveys that are used to inform things like development policy, government policy and planning, men aren't actually even included at all. And considering the role of the patriarchy in a lot of different contexts, it seems a little bit wild that men's attitudes aren't considered important when we think about things like agency and autonomy and access to care. And often these surveys really present themselves as apolitical and atheoretical. And that's something that I really wanted to unpack in this. And so in the quantitative survey design for this PhD, the theoretical assumptions are made explicit. And those are that the design used feminist and queer epistemologies and theories in destabilizing, decategorizing a lot of the outputs that we were looking at. So open-ended questions, allowing respondents to self-define, broadening beyond men as partners to anyone who considered themselves to be a man, making them eligible for taking part in this. And in particular, because of that relationality behind masculinities, allowing in the survey a relational aspect. So whereas in previous surveys, things like attitudes were asked in the singular, fixed attitudes. What is your view on domestic violence? Instead, we really wanted to understand how these views change, or if they change, depending on who the hypothetical other is. And so in doing so, we created a survey that responded by allowing men to tell us who those respondents, who those others were. And in the situation of people talking about their partners, actively situating one or all, so it could be multiple, of their partners by asking them the questions again and again. Now, all of this had to change because of COVID and because of the nature of the pandemic. We could not do physical, in-person methods. So if you think about a household survey going literally from household to household, you're basically looking like you're going to turn into Typhoid Mary and you're going to spread COVID from household to household to household. That is extremely unethical, it is dangerous, and it is potentially deadly. So it was really clear that these methods had to change. And in this process, we were considering a bunch of different methods that could facilitate the safe continuation of this research. So we had smartphone administered surveys, computer-based surveys, SMS messaging, mobile telephone, or Skype, Zoom, other platforms that allowed a video. And eventually we came to mobile telephones as the main mechanism with which we would collect data. Why? Well, it relied less on literacy, because what we had was a research team who were on the other end of the phone, who was still administering the survey exactly as they would have in person and writing their responses on their laptops. So it still allowed that interaction. Moreover, there was more mobile phone access and ownership in urban Ghana than there were other things like computer access. And in particular, telephones don't rely on the need for mobile data. It's estimated around 94% of people within Ghana, or within urban Ghana, have access or own some form of mobile phone. And lastly, it's a cost effective. This is a PhD research. We really didn't have access to things like tablets. We couldn't design and implement a questionnaire in the timeframe necessary that could be put onto an app, for example. So this was cost effective. The research team were all given YAM, which is like brick phones if you're British, or basically just very old like Nokia style phones, headsets, external hard drives for their laptops, and different SIM cards, and then credit to call people on those. And that was a really cost-effective way of switching this into mobile phone territory, and one that tried and attempted to recognize the limitations of certain methods in this particular context in Jamestown, in Accra, an urban area that is characterized, well, not characterized, it's characterized by a huge artistic movement and the Gar community having their home there, who are the indigenous community within that area, but also it's low income, low resource, low infrastructure, has very little in the way of support. So there are kind of more challenges when thinking about what is accessible for the average, in inverted commas, person. Of course, though, this came with expected implications. One of the biggest ones is that we simply could not rely on gatekeepers because we couldn't see and assess the interaction of that gatekeeper with a respondent. So the sample had to be 18 and over. They had to be people who could give consent themselves. Moreover, even though 94% of people have access or own a mobile phone, that means that at least 6% of people don't. So already we're looking at an exclusive, non-universal method. These types of technology, particularly the fact that it would be completely audio and that we couldn't rely on a gatekeeper, for example, an interpreter, mean that certain populations in particular, for example, the deaf community, would also be left out. And moreover, there are questions around the types of responses that people might give over the phone, whether they trust someone. Research indicates that people talk for less time and that they are potentially less interested. So these were the kinds of expected implications that we were facing by doing this modality change. But we also had some quite interesting sort of experiences emerge during this time. One of the main ones was that we really needed still to have some forms of technology. I was still based in the UK at that point because I'd had to go back. So that whole modality change occurred in the space of 4 days before I was sent home to the UK from Ghana. The research team were based in Ghana anyway. So it still relied on the fact that the research team had access to laptops, to internet themselves, that they could remotely and securely send files, so that we could problem solve, respond to issues around respondents and also issues around the questionnaire itself. And that is something to take into consideration with this modality, that it does still have implications and infrastructural needs, particularly for the research team. Moreover, we had this sort of out of sight, out of mind impact, and that occurred in various different ways. One of the major ones, which we maybe expected, was that men simply didn't necessarily trust us. We were strangers, calling them, asking for not only their name, well, not their names, but not only, you know, their ages, their ethnicity, also their marital status, their partnerships, all these kinds of things. We were also asking their opinion on abortion. It's a little dodgy to just get a phone call and see how that goes. And the respondent-driven sampling helped us, because what happened was we then asked respondents to refer their friends to try and waylay that. But it still meant that men didn't necessarily always trust us. They wanted to see people face to face. That simply couldn't happen at that time under the conditions of COVID. But also the out of sight, out of mind meant that we had to consider prompts a lot more. We simply weren't there physically to remind people that we were going to interview them. So men would suggest a time, we would then call them at that time, and they would be busy, and we would call back later, they would be busy again. So it took a lot more in terms of the actual behind the scenes time that we hadn't necessarily factored in, and it made the research process a bit slower. It was also an incredibly important reminder that what is being researched by the research team is simply just not someone else's priority. People have other things to do with their lives, and it's such a privilege for us to be involved in that research at all. Moreover, what was really interesting was, compared to a household survey, the use of this modality really showed us the types of social networks that men existed in. So what you see here is the enumeration areas within neighborhood boundaries in Accra, Ghana. You can see they're basically straight lines written for the purposes of taking census data. And in a household survey, in the preparation for the household survey, we had done a random sample of this area here that's marked 24, within which there are enumeration areas we've done a random sample of, and we're going to survey within those. Now, with mobile technologies, those boundaries are less physical, they simply don't exist. So what we found is that men were really telling us they had multiple addresses, that they sometimes lived in Jamestown, which is where the study was, but sometimes they lived elsewhere. that they had friends they wanted to refer who lived just on the other side of the boundary road. These boundaries are often defined by things like blocks and roads and landmarks. Someone might live on the other side. And it's a really nice reminder of the lived realities of the folks taking part in our sample and the nature of social interaction. And there was this real shift in the balance of power, because men really had the autonomy, the agency, for example, to hang up if they didn't want to take part. They don't need, when they withdraw, to ask you to leave their property if it's a household survey, which I think is really important when we think about unsettling the nature of research and some of the assumptions behind research. Moreover, we actually see the inclusion of some populations, typically, and I put them in inverted commas because hard to reach is such a problematic phrase, but who are typically categorized as hard to reach or hidden. And in this situation, men were very open with us about their sexualities and even about their gender. And that's quite exemplary given the context where being LGBTQ is not necessarily something that one can do publicly, particularly if you've seen in the news at the moment. But of course, it still came with the same experiences of lack of inclusion of other populations. What was telling is that men really talked to us. They spoke for hours. Our interviews lasted as long as we would have expected them to last in person. There was a 97% completion rate of men who started the survey to men who finished it, which showed us that men were really happy to talk on the phone. And in fact, lots of them would ask us to stop, pause, call back so they could go off and do other things. And it's interesting to think whether actually that high completion rate is to do with the fact that they had the autonomy rather than just withdrawing to actually dip in and out. And I think that again speaks to that shift of the balance of power. But of course, the main thing was, what is this survey actually telling us? That's what we really want to think about. Is the survey going to work? And what we can see is that as well as unsettling some of the assumptions in survey design, we actually see that the survey itself did show us that we really need to start thinking beyond some of our assumptions in the data we actually collect. So for example, here you have the question we have on relationships. And we ask people to just describe their relationship that they were in with their own words. And this research note, which was made by one of the research team, shows us the complexity around how men categorize their relations around them. He talks about a child's mother, a wife, and a girlfriend. And we see that a lot, where you have a wife as someone who you're married to, whereas a child's mother is one who you're not living with, but who has a child with you. That was a specific category of person that came up again and again, a relation of person, often not captured in typical household surveys. Moreover, when we had this relationality where we would ask men, again, depending on who the person was, could you tell us your attitude? You can see when we ask, would you be happy if your girlfriend becomes pregnant now? Respondent 1 here says, once I am responsible. When asked about his side chick, he says, she has to decide. When asked about his second side chick, and that's his language, he then said again, I am happy once she wants to give birth. His opinion was related to the category of person he was thinking about, the relation of person he was thinking about. His attitude was not consistent or static or fixed, which is often what we see assumed in some of our global quantitative data. And these feedback loops were really facilitated by the modality change, by the use of laptops, so that rather than making respondents feel potentially uncomfortable by writing copious notes in front of them, or just not capturing those details at all, we actually see that the use of a headset and laptop allowed the research team to write these additional notes. Here you can see, when asked about whether he knows what the law is in Ghana, he says, I don't know, but I think it's murder when it comes to the law on abortion, which is such an interesting and important point when we think about the purpose of this study, to find out what men are thinking, what they're doing, how they relate themselves to abortion. Moreover, you can see here, and I'm not expecting you to read it, but you can see here just how much information can be captured through this modality change, through the use of a laptop, where here, although the respondent says, I won't be happy if they have an abortion without my permission, there's a whole story there that can be captured that tells us so much about why that man thinks that is so critical to this research. So what it tells us is that not only when we unsettle quantitative surveys, we get a much deeper understanding of the complexities and realities of the context within which abortion and emergency contraception is being sought. We can understand how men situate themselves in that by understanding that men don't operate simply as partners, but there are relations to a variety of different people who have a variety of different thought processes that take them to this point of thinking whether they would support or not support abortions. The switch to mobile phone methods really captured these complexities, but also facilitated even more capture. So it did exactly what we had hoped it would do in terms of it allowed the survey to do what we wanted it to do, but actually it facilitated us to go even further with what we wanted the survey to do. And moreover, it actually challenges, it unsettles not only this notion of who men are and of the implications of men in this broader context of women and pregnant people's reproductive justice, it challenges the modes of data collection that we have in existence. It challenges the assumptions in our sample surveys around the types of men we talk to and the questions that we ask. So importantly, it really reminds us that the primary function of quantitative data are to represent our realities and complexities. We are not here to fit the data. And unsettling quantitative data and survey design and utilizing new modalities can take us that bit further to getting to those realities and complexities. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for DSA for putting on this conference. I really hope you enjoyed it. And at the beginning, you can find my email, which is j.strong3@lse.ac.uk. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions then. Until then, take care, everyone. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Joe, for that very engaging presentation. I really enjoyed, just hearing how you explain about the local context, how important it is in producing and understanding the data that is gathered through the research. I think that reminds me of the just the complexities of being human, really similar to what you mentioned in the final slide. Yeah, so if you have questions for Joe to the audience, please do put them in the chat. And we will address them at the end of the session. So last but not least, we will now hear from Susie Loader, one of the 2 DSA Dissertation Prize 2021 winners. Congratulations, Susie. Susie's paper looks at the media landscape in Kenya and is based on the remote research she had conducted for her MSc dissertation at the University of Edinburgh. This presentation will elaborate on the analysis of data gathered from traditional media as well as social media, and some remote semi-structured interviews that Susie had conducted with interview participants in Kenya.
Good morning, everyone. I hope this is recording all right, and I've not done it before, so bear with me. It feels a bit weird to be greeting my own laptop screen in my empty flat, but I think it would be weirder to start with any form of greeting whatsoever. I'm incredibly honoured and grateful to be one of the 2 students awarded the DSA Dissertation Prize this year, and to have been given the opportunity to share my research experiences with you. As the title of my presentation or my paper suggests, I'm not going to be focusing on the findings of my research, but rather the research process and experiences itself. I'll be explaining what I did, how I did it, the challenges I faced, and the lessons I've learned from working within the context of a global pandemic, which I don't think is something that any of us expected. For the purposes of clarity and context, however, what I thought I'd do is begin with a brief introduction about my background, my research interests, and how I chose my final dissertation focus. As a trained teacher of English, literature and language, I've always harboured a keen interest in the power of language, but until this point had only really explored it in the context of the arts as opposed to the social sciences. Having studied and explored modules exploring the depiction of humanitarian aid in the media and the growing use and importance of social media as a tool to reach wider audiences and challenge some of the more problematic elements of the NGO sector, I quickly realised that this was an area I wanted to explore further in my own research. I was interested in the debates for and against the internet as a truly democratic and revolutionary space in general, but was particularly interested in how this translates to the NGO sector. I'd read studies investigating the ways in which NGOs have attempted to use social media to challenge their problematic depictions of the beneficiaries of aid they work with. And I'd seen examples of Twitter takeovers designed to give voice and visibility to the communities working alongside NGOs, but I'd found that the majority of this research had been done within the humanitarian aid sector. Given the complexity and visibility of the debates regarding humans' relationship with wildlife and the rising tension caused by increasing competition for natural resources, I'd seen surprisingly little research about the ways in which humans living in close proximity to wildlife were depicted in conservation NGOs' communications, particularly those seeking to alleviate human-wildlife conflict. My initial plan, therefore, was to examine the ways in which conservation NGOs were creating content about human-wildlife interactions, and I decided to cite my research in Kenya due to its long and complex history with human-wildlife conflict. Through observing and analysing the ways in which content was created, shared, and received, I aimed to determine whether or not current practice effectively included the voices, opinions, experiences, and decisions of communities working alongside the NGO in question. But to do so would require extensive research in the field. And with the restrictions imposed by COVID lockdown, this clearly would have been impossible, and I would not have been able to adequately answer the questions I was posing in my research design. I knew I still wanted to explore language and representation within the conservation sector in some way. And with access to newspaper archives and social media sites, I knew I could find a way to do so remotely. So I decided to focus my analysis on the contents itself rather than the process of its creation. I therefore decided to explore how human-wildlife conflict interactions were being depicted in the Kenyan media landscape and how these depictions interacted with dominant conservation discourses. To facilitate the research, I addressed 3 supplementary research questions. What type of human-wildlife interactions are given most salience and how are they framed? What referential and predicational strategies are used to depict the humans and wildlife involved, and what type of interpretations does this encourage? And finally, what implications might this have on current and future conservation initiatives and the dominance of Western conservation ideology? Having managed to adapt my research question to suit the restrictions of COVID lockdown, I still had to ensure that what I did made sure that my analysis was robust, meaningful, and objective. My first challenge was to decide what kind of data I would use, how much I'd need, and how I would collect it. Initially, I considered conducting an analysis based on the content gathered from different Kenyan newspapers, but given my interest in social media, the diversity of Kenya's media landscape, and the growing use of social media to address misrepresentation in the aid sector, I decided that a study comprising of both these mediums would be more appropriate. Additionally, given that I was conducting my research remotely, a comparative study would also broaden the scope of the types of content that I would access as part of my research, therefore enabling me to be better positioned to develop an understanding of the specific audiences and contexts in the production of content about human-wildlife interactions. To ensure that the data set was manageable and meaningful, I narrowed my focus to one print news outlet. I conducted a search on LexisNexis for Kenyan news items containing human-wildlife conflict and/or coexistence over the period of 2.5 years, and in this initial sample, 78% of the results were from either the Daily Nation or Sunday Nation newspapers. I had hoped to be able to look at the archives from The Standard, another prominent Kenyan newspaper, but unfortunately I did not have access to this material remotely. As the Nation papers, however, are both published by the prominent Nation media group and are widely read across Kenya, this seemed the most suitable choice for my analysis, and with full archives available on LexisNexis, the most reliable. I subsequently downloaded all articles containing human-wildlife conflict or human-wildlife coexistence, written within the pre-specified time frame, and discarded articles that reported on events outside of Kenya or that only mentioned them in passing. This left me with 73 articles and plenty of material for analysis. When selecting conservation NGOs for comparison, the decision-making process wasn't quite so straightforward, as I had various options available. I could focus on one NGO and conduct an analysis of all of the content on their websites and social media accounts. I could include multiple NGOs and look at multiple platforms of content, or I could look at multiple NGOs and focus on one social media platform. Each of these approaches would provide meaningful insights into the depiction and framing of human-wildlife interactions, but I was concerned that the inclusion of multiple authors and platforms would limit the clarity of my analysis and spread it too thinly. As such, I chose to focus on the Twitter feeds of the well-established American NGO AWF, an organisation that prides itself on being the oldest and largest conservation organisation that focuses solely on the African continent and is committed to amplifying the African voice on wildlife and wildland conservation globally, and the two much smaller Kenyan-based NGOs, Lion Guardians and Ewaso Lions, both of whom are committed to promoting coexistence and the amplification of African voices. Through the inclusion of a range of organisations and designing a comparative study of different media outlets, I ensured that my data collection facilitated a more balanced insight into the content collected and analysed. The decision to focus solely on Twitter content as opposed to that of Facebook or Instagram was also one that was carefully considered. Firstly, as it's one of the more popular social media platforms in Kenya, I anticipated that I'd find sufficient data to explore and examine. And by using the same platform to gather data from the three NGOs, I ensured consistency in my analysis, as the data gathered were produced using the same tools, were located in the same digital space, and had the same potential audience. I gathered tweets posted within the same time frame as the newspaper articles I'd gathered, which amounted to 1,750 tweets, again, providing plenty of material for analysis and interpretation. Using Twitter data published by organisations rather than individuals also meant that it was far simpler to ensure that I was conducting my research ethically. Social media is notoriously problematic with regards to ethics, as its fluidity of users, purposes, content, and terms of agreement render it difficult to categorise. Whilst other types of data are easy to identify as either public and therefore freely accessible for analysis, or private, requiring informed consent before use, social media is far more complex, as the distinction between public and private is more blurred. Fortunately, the ethical concerns of my research were clear-cut, as I was using data taken from organisational rather than individual accounts, or posts shared in private groups or forums. As such, I could be confident in assuming that the content collected did not represent that of an individual unaware of how their data was being used and accessed, but of an established organisation actively seeking exposure and public engagement. Additionally, I could be confident in identifying content gathered as public through the conditions of use outlined by Pace and Livingston, as the tweets collected were publicly archived and readily available without being a registered user or account follower, and as the material was not sensitive in nature or its use prohibited by Twitter's policies, it was permissible to both quote and analyse content without consent, although I did inform each organisation of my research intent and invited them to participate. I also registered a developer account on Twitter, informed them of my research plans, and referred to their policies throughout my research. In doing all of this, I ensured that my data collection was transparent and ethical. After gathering my newspaper articles and tweets, I needed to think really carefully about how I was going to analyse them. They aren't the most straightforward of mediums to compare after all. Before conducting close linguistic analysis, I had to first ascertain what type of human-wildlife interactions were given most salience and how they were framed. I decided that the best way to do this was to conduct content analysis on the articles and tweets collected. I wanted to ensure a systematic approach to this element of my research, and so created detailed coding manuals for each of my data sets. In an ideal world, I would have used the same coding manual for all content categorized, but as the content was so varied, this just wasn't possible. After categorizing all of my material, I then condensed the codes used to general groupings, as this allowed for an easier identification of the key similarities and differences in the human-wildlife interactions reported and the frames that were used to depict them. And as the findings demonstrated clear differences in the depiction of specific humans and wildlife involved in these interactions, this informed the focus of my subsequent critical discourse analysis and influenced the choices made when selecting texts for further analysis. There are many approaches, to discourse analysis, but as I was seeking to examine the linguistic features of texts within the context of the social sciences, I felt that Fairclough's model seemed most appropriate. As I was focusing on the depiction of specific groups involved in human-wildlife interactions and the descriptions of their experiences and behaviours, I narrowed my analysis further by focusing on the referential and predicational strategies used in each text. By focusing on a specific element of my dataset, rather than broader observations about linguistic choices made by the text's authors, I was able to conduct a deeper analysis of the content gathered and ensured that I was able to conduct detailed and confident comparisons of the ways in which human and wildlife interactions were depicted in a small part of the Kenyan media landscape. Using critical discourse analysis in this way provided a clear insight into how audiences are encouraged to interpret and perceive events. But as I was aware, there was no textual analysis, or no type of textual analysis, especially when conducted remotely, could tell you how audiences actually interpret them. Consequently, I had to be mindful of my own potential biases because, as Fairclough says, there's no such thing as an objective analysis. To try and mitigate the impact of this, I used pre-written instructions when conducting my analysis, but given that most critical discourse analysis examining journalistic practice focuses on the news produced in the global north, I could not assume that the discursive practices of Kenyan news production were the same as those in the global north. Additionally, I was aware that the sources examined were those readily available on LexisNexis and Twitter, and I was therefore not being exposed to possible counter-narratives published in Swahili or those that were being circulated from localized sources like radio stations. To minimize the impact of my own experiences and to try and account for content created for different audiences, I therefore chose to conduct interviews with various stakeholders in the conservation sector. This facilitated a more objective and nuanced understanding of the impact of relevant context underlying the production of content, and further consolidated my understanding of how particular items were intended to be interpreted. Whilst I was confident that conducting interviews would strengthen the integrity of my research, it proved to be one of the more challenging parts of my data collection, resulting in a procurement of participants at institutional rather than grassroots level. I was really fortunate in that I was introduced to key contacts in the field, but I still had to grapple with the fact that I'd not yet met or built a rapport with any of my interviewees. I was aware that my identity as a British international development student would potentially cause reluctance to participate, and indeed encountered some organisations that declined my request for interview due to negative past experiences. So I made every effort to make participants as comfortable as possible by being as transparent as possible and by creating an informal atmosphere in my interviews. I sent questions in advance if it was requested. I sought consent verbally rather than in writing. I made all my interviewees anonymous, and I did not record my interviews. Alongside the obstacle of building trust remotely, the global pandemic did further complicate the interview process, as all my participants were working from home and were regularly using Zoom or Skype for both professional and personal purposes. Consequently, some of my participants expressed reluctance to use video calling technology as they were experiencing Zoom fatigue. To deal with this, I ensured that I was available at times that suited them and offered WhatsApp, email, Skype, and Zoom as options to conduct the interviews. Approximately half of the respondents chose to conduct their interviews via email, which did impact the amount of questions I was able to ask. If I asked too many, I was concerned that the answers I received would be less detailed, but I decided that less questions with key voices in the field was infinitely preferable to no questions at all. Despite these challenges, the interviews conducted enabled a more thorough mixed methods approach to my research and provided vital insight into the text production process that would not have been gleaned from content and critical discourse analysis alone. Of vital importance, of course, was that they enabled the mitigation and monitoring of the presence of researcher bias in my textual analysis. Obviously, conducting my MSc research within the context of a global pandemic was not what I'd anticipated or desired, but I learned a lot from the process and thoroughly enjoyed both researching and writing my dissertation. In fact, I feel that the constraints posed by COVID strengthened my overall approach to my dissertation. As I was conducting my research remotely, I had to think really carefully about what specifically my research question was and how I was going to answer it. I had to consider what data I'd need, how best to gather it, and what it could tell me. To mitigate the presence of researcher bias, I had to adopt a mixed methods approach, and in doing so, added richness and texture to my research that I may not have sought as explicitly if I was working in the field. My remote research also made me more critical and reflective in the conclusions I drew. Whilst I took every effort to ensure that the analysis I conducted was as objective as possible, I felt it important to define the parameters of my research to avoid the drawing of unwarranted conclusions. The data selected were not sufficient to be considered representative of the depiction of human-wildlife interactions in the Kenyan media landscape, and the analysis conducted could only offer possible interpretations of the content included rather than actual responses. What my dissertation could provide was initial insights into the depiction of human-wildlife conflict in the Kenyan media landscape and a prompt for further research and discussion. In turning the focus away from news production in the global north and examining the ways in which these specific outlets engage with dominant discourses in the conservation sector, I hope that the findings of my dissertation offer possible patterns of current practice and what this might mean in relation to its engagement with the broader aims of the conservation sector. Whilst remote research can never be a replacement for research conducted in the field, my experiences have been positive and would suggest that remote research can provide meaningful contributions so long as its design is carefully considered, its approach is inherently reflective, and its limitations clearly defined and recognised. Having said all of this, though, I sincerely hope that no one finds it necessary to adapt their preferred research methods in the future due to the influence of a global pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susie, for that really great presentation. Really enjoyed hearing how you described the steps you took to conduct your data gathering and analyze the data for your dissertation. And I hope that the next time all of us conduct field research, it will be with the methods of our choice and not the ones that we were forced to choose due to the circumstances. And now it is time to for the live Q&A. It's what all of us have been waiting for, the live Q&A with the panel speakers. So from presentation 1, we have Nicola Banks. From presentation 2, we have Kavita Kasala and Padmaja Ravula with us. From presentation 3, we have Joe Strong. And from presentation 4, Susie Loader. Hi, everyone. It's really great to see your faces today. I invite the audience to submit their questions if they have any questions for any of the speakers. Perhaps I could kick off with one question for all of the participants relating to the pandemic impact on your research participants. Since all of your research was conducted during COVID-19, I wanted to hear about this impact on your research participants. In Kavita's and Susie's presentations that your participants were experiencing high stress levels as well as Zoom fatigue in the case of Susie as a result of the pandemic. I wanted to hear from Joe and Nicola. Perhaps did you experience the same with your participants? Did they express any of these concerns to you at all? Maybe.
Yes, shall I just jump in? So I'm afraid it's just me here answering questions today. I think that the main, so attrition, so from our sample, which is a much bigger sampling frame than some of the other presentations that were there today. So we started off with around 7,500 households that responded in the first survey round. So they got their phone call, they answered the questions, and then that was that. But as Imran said, there were three different panels, 3 different kind of longitudinal samples, and where you'd see that being a problem, that whether it was fatigue in general with life, whether it was not wanting to answer questions anymore, you'd see people leaving that sample frame. I think there were definitely some level of attrition. I don't think it was particularly high. But I'm afraid I can't put numbers to it. I would need Imran or Zilla by there to do that. But I think it's a real issue, and perhaps it's the main ethical issue of research like this in unprecedented times like this, because people's lives and livelihoods are under such strain and pressure, we absolutely have to think about that, whether we want to layer more. It's not necessarily a big burden, but it's another thing for people to have to think about and handle at a really difficult crisis point. So I would say that it's a really huge ethical question that we need to ask ourselves.
Yeah. What about Joe? Did you encounter any of that?
Yeah, it's a really, can you hear me, by the way? Sorry, I'm using new headphones.
Yeah, we can.
Great. It's a really interesting question. It's one that we grappled with a lot, with this kind of capacity around whether it's actually ethical to even, ask people to give up time and capacity to take part in research during these times. What was interesting is working with the team and working through this mobile phone method. What we actually found was that men responded really positively to this at that time, because a lot of their life, so where we were in Accra, or where my team were in Accra, the team was in a form of lockdown with a form of physical distancing, and people actually enjoyed the interaction. It was really welcome to have this kind of break to talk about something other than just the pandemic. And I think one of the things that was really interesting was the conversation we were having, which is kind of this cross-contextual, geopolitical conversation of the UK at this point, really being essentially on fire in terms of where it was at with the pandemic, and people really needing this time and this space for self-care and capacity, and actually the situation in Ghana being very radically different, and therefore having this conversation of me as a global north researcher who was at that point then based back in the global north, saying, should we even be doing this at all? Do we have a right to even ask people for this time? And then my colleague saying, well, yeah, that's your situation, but what about, this is the situation here. And I think having that, again, that just constant communication with not only as a team, but I think also with participants themselves, like giving them that time to chat. And I think what's telling is that, we had I know it's tiny compared to Nicola, the study that you were talking about, but we had a completion rate of 97%. We really didn't have many people drop out, and the people who did drop out, they dropped out because they didn't really like some of the questions. They didn't like answering questions around socioeconomics, and they said that they'd rather just not take part. The wonderful thing about mobile phones, you can just hang up, and there's no accountability. You're not having to walk out of a room. You're not having to ask someone to leave. If you're having a household survey, you literally just are able to press a button, and that's it. That's your participation. That's your consent withdrawn. You're done. But I think it is a really interesting question that you raised, Octavia, about Joanna, about the role of research and in the center of what we're doing, that with mentally and capacity-wise being known as well.
Can I add one more thought here, actually, because that I think triggered another thought in my head, Joe. One of the things I've always grappled with doing research since my PhD research many years ago is trying to explain to people the reason of your research. So we all do research because we believe that the knowledge that we'll gain from that will help not them, but people like them in the future. They'll help policymakers understand different groups and maybe help us respond better. And this is an example, all of these projects, when they're taking place at such crisis point, it's a time when actually it will help these people much more quickly. It will help the government respond in rapid time to crises. So that is a different type of ethical implication. It's a positive when it comes to the ethics of research like this, because without it, people are operating in the dark. So I think that's also something to think about. It's a nice thing for a researcher to be able to say, this is needed right now, and your response will really help us to understand what people can do in these times.
That's great. Yeah. We have a question from Kate, I think. Kate, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the panelists directly?
Yeah, thanks very much everyone for the really interesting presentations. It was really great, sort of the variety of different kinds of studies and different kinds of methodologies. Unfortunately, I had to leave at a couple of points, so I may have missed some things, but what struck me is there's sort of a couple of themes that sort of seem to be coming out, which is one is around adapting methods, sort of either existing projects or even sort of thinking about how to do research in the coming months or even a couple of years, and sort of working around, versus is this actually an opportunity to kind of rethink some ways that we do research, and kind of actually, rather than trying to get back to normal or like business as usual, that we actually see it as a bit of an opportunity to do things differently. So I'd be kind of interested to hear reflections on those two possible paths, or not that they're not mutually exclusive, but those two sort of approaches. And then I also just had a couple of like practical questions, because I'm grappling with it as well, about trying to do some remote elite interviews with policymakers in Zambia. And I'm not sure whether you'll have sort of experience of this, but I guess a couple of things that have come up for me is, how do you, I found when I've been doing research in Zambia that often it's sort of by showing up at people's offices, and kind of particularly sort of ministers or sort of high level people, that you get the interview by being there. And I'm not quite sure how I'm going to replicate that in trying to set up, because quite often it's hard to pre-arrange interviews. They sort of happen sort of quite spontaneously. So trying to pre-arrange them on Zoom might be a bit tricky. So any experience of that kind of thing. And then I guess the other question is, if you don't already have, so the partnerships aspect was really great. So I guess the first presentation was talking about strengthening partnerships that are already there, but what if you don't necessarily have those contacts already? Like, how do you build them from a distance? So yeah, if any experiences or this would be helpful on those. Thank you.
Does anyone want to start?
I can talk about my experiences building and trying to contact people to interview, because I did all of mine remotely. And I was fortunate in that my supervisor put me in touch with a really key contact in Kenya, who was then able to give me some names and also some introductions with people both in journalism and the conservation sector. So I think having someone who can make introductions for you is really helpful. But some of my most fruitful interviews came from contacting people on Twitter, actually, and on social media. So some researchers I was interested in speaking to, and contacting the NGOs directly, and using social media as a kind of way in, because you can have a conversation that's fairly uninvasive. You can send someone a message, and like I think you were saying, when you can just hang up a phone call, they can choose not to respond. You're not pestering them in that sense. And they kind of have to, in some media platforms, they have to even accept your request to contact them before anything else happens. And because I kept my messages quite short and clear, and just said, this is what I'm interested in talking to you about if you have any time, and then making myself really flexible in terms of how we spoke, when we spoke, whether it is, if they wanted the questions beforehand. I think a lot of it came down to thinking carefully about how you want the power dynamic to be played out. So I gave a lot of autonomy to the people I was speaking to, and said, I'm not going to record the interviews. I think as well, when you don't know someone, pressing record kind of makes everything a bit more stilted. So I said I wasn't going to record interviews. I asked if it was okay if I made notes by hand. I sent questions beforehand for those that wanted them, and then I sent a summary of what we discussed and gave them the opportunity to withdraw any comments they didn't want to be included as part of my research. So I think being really flexible and giving people the chance to withdraw that at any point helped. Obviously, it's not a replacement from being able to talk to someone face to face. I did struggle to have some interviews with people higher up who I'd call and then there wasn't an answer, or so you kind of had, I think you had to expect to take a couple of hits in that sense, but it is doable.
What about Joe? And oh, sorry, Joe. Yeah, go on.
Well, Nicola, did you want to say?
No, after you, Joe, please.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Susie said, I think is exactly right. I've only done a limited amount, but it was that situation of just having to clear a whole day, almost like you would, as you were saying, Kate, I'm exactly in agreement, like almost exactly like you would expect to do if you were in person, having to basically, you know, clear a lot more time than might necessarily be what you would expect for just an interview to say, hey, I'm going to be available for you from this. Was something that I found. So I'd like plonk myself down in a cafe. I was doing some interviews in Ethiopia, Malawi, Zambia, but I was based in Ghana. So I just plonk myself down in a cafe and be like, when an interview happens, it happens. In terms of partnerships, so I know that there are definitely a few, and it depends on what you have already, but I know from a few, talking to a few kind of people in their nascency of their research, a lot of them have kind of utilized research institutes in the different contexts that they want to be in, so they don't have to travel. So for example, people who are connecting to either labs, research institutes, or specific researchers in the context who themselves will have networks of researchers, and they're basically kind of flattening, in a sense, the research project, because it means that you sort of then have to give, you know, your resources and you that power over in terms of sharing it with potentially collaborators and partners, but having to kind of be, I think, a little bit more go for their kind of, I don't know how to put it, like through an institution sometimes, I think, is kind of your best bet, where there's already research taking place. So universities or research institutes in Zambia, it can come with, you know, associated costs, but it also, you know, is part of that. It also helps build a partnership that actually I think is really important for research anyway. And in terms of the first part of your question, I totally see this as a complete, like, for me, this, although these research methods had to be changed because of COVID, I don't regret at all having used these as methods. And actually, I think there are so many positives that we can learn from this that mean that we shouldn't see these as compromises, but developments and evolutions of the methods that we've had. Definitely, I think there's so much to be said about using remote methods. And I think also thinking in the future more holistically, when we think about populations who are designated and termed hard to reach, if we think about populations who are have varied needs, the fact that in the past we've often gone in with our qualitative method, our quantitative method, I think it's increasingly questionable. I think there's no reason why we couldn't say, yes, we will be doing this survey and these interviews in person if you want them, but we will also do them over the phone if you want them. We will make plural our methodologies to suit the fact that our respondents are plural, and there are pluralities within the respondents. You know, as I was saying, telephones suck for accessibility. They suck for people who don't have the means to access a telephone. They're great for people who are very time poor, who really don't want to have to sit down in a specific place, who don't want to travel. Sorry, I'm also going to say hello to the cat. So I think, you know, I think that's a learning that we can take from this, is I think that these methods do work. There are those limitations, but they can get you. They do really important, they have a really important role in questioning and critiquing our existing methodologies. Why have we always used those methods? What are the potential futures with new technology? Thinking about what Susie was saying about taking notes. When you're online, you have your laptop, suddenly the idea of note taking by hand can be so different if you're able to actually take notes on Microsoft Word way faster. You know, as you're saying, Susie, I think, yeah, people don't necessarily like being recorded, but also there is the option to record, in which case, how much easier is that than like the old school recording devices where the batteries would melt and then you would be like, oh my goodness, I've just lost all of my recording. I think there's a lot of future there, and I think definitely for me this is an evolutionary moment rather than a reactionary moment in terms of how we can build forward.
Great. And Nicola, do you have anything to add? Or?
I mean, I totally agree with what Joe has just said, actually, that it's been a momentously difficult year. And I think particularly for people at earlier stages in their career, who usually have people to draw on in terms of advice and support. So PhD supervisors, master's dissertation supervisors, you have people that you can ask about, but because none of them have also had this experience, you guys have all just gone for it and beaten a lot of us to it. It's been amazing how innovative, how thoughtful, how rigorous you've been in this new world. And I think that deserves a huge amount of respect.
Yeah, that's great. And Kavita, do you see this as a replacement to in-person survey, or is the remote data collection a data collection in itself, you think?
Yes, I agree with Joe. Rather than taking this as a constraint, maybe we evolved through the process of data collection. And as prescribed, we were going in the traditional approach of data collection of personal interviewing in the first 3 rounds. But in the 4th round, we moved on to the remote data collection. And let me tell you, it was an experience in itself for the researcher also, who was first time involved in remote data collection, especially with the literate and illiterate population. And the experience was new both for the study participant and the researcher as well. And as much as you see, even though we had a lot of experience and existing relationships with the participants for the past few years, still the telephonic survey was a bit intimidating for certain participants and even also for the enumerators. Maybe as we move on in this COVID-19 era or the pandemic, maybe we will be looking forward to much more innovations in remote data collection. And definitely, more than the disadvantages, I see more advantages in this. Only thing is, we have to refine the methods of the conversations, both informal and formal, when we are doing a survey through the telephonic surveys. And the kind of training that has to be given to the researcher or enumerators in doing such remote data collection is very, very important. And there is also a strong issue in the lower and middle income countries is the unavailability of internet connection or even the devices themselves. So that may have to be handled very well in order to meet the target group of populations, such as women, adolescents, or mothers of young children, and so on. Maybe we are thinking ahead, and I think Dr. Padmaja, who is a gender scientist, would want to much say about this. And we are evolving, and the research team at ICRISAT is really trying to look out to how to innovate ways and methods to do remote data collection through these processes. This is the first time we have done with the quantitative data collection. We are also thinking of methods doing the qualitative focus group discussions as well through remote way. Maybe we will be evolving, and then we would also want to hear and learn from the others' research as well. Thank you, Joanna.
That's really great. Thank you, everyone. We have a question from Christopher. Christopher, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the panelists directly?
Yeah, it's just a very quick follow-up question. So this was really interesting to hear from everyone. And Susie, you mentioned one thing that I found interesting, that you sent the responses to your interviewees and gave them the chance to comment on them. I was just wondering whether anyone got back to you and said, oh, I would really like to take back that opinion, or can you change this or not? Because that's something I haven't heard, and it would just be interesting to know your practical experience with that technique.
Yeah, there was one participant who wanted a particular place not mentioned, just to make it as a bit more of an abstract comment. But for the most part, if anything, people added a few more comments to what I'd written down. So that in itself was really helpful, I think, as well. Bearing in mind, when I was interviewing most of my participants, it was the first time we'd seen each other. It was quite a lot going on, and technical difficulties and all sorts of time differences. So having that kind of giving them some time to think about what we discussed and come back to it and add to it if they wanted to. I think it helped them to trust me a bit more, to say that I was being really transparent with it. And as I said, it just made sure that I could confidently include my data ethically. And yeah, if anything, it added to some of the detail. People kind of added a few more reflections and anecdotes when they got back to me.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Also, I have another question. Does anyone else have any? If no one else has questions for now, I do have a question for all of the panelists. Since all of your research was conducted in different countries with diverse conditions and local contexts, in your opinion, what role did the local culture, norms, or context play in the successes or challenges you had faced when conducting remote research? Are there some insights from the field that you could share with us, perhaps? We could start maybe with Joe, since you're You're the first on my screen.
That's a big question, Joanna. That's a really big question, but it's a really interesting one, and I think it's such an important one. So certainly in Ghana, phone calls are a really common form of communication. So you're not having to deal necessarily with maybe what anecdotally you might find, say, for example, if I think anecdotally amongst my friends based in the UK of a similar age, we hate phone calls, we never do phone calls, literally they're the worst thing you could ever imagine. Susie, you're nodding along, like you get it. Someone calling you is just nightmarish versus like I would much rather communicate via WhatsApp or another form of something or other. That wasn't the case in Ghana. That helped us, like, you know, phone calls you weren't having to necessarily get through that barrier of kind of people just hate this medium with a passion. So it helped. And that's one of the reasons why when we were working through this as a team, when we were in this kind of crisis management in a cafe being like, there's a pandemic, what do we do? Phones were actually a kind of quite obvious scenario because you see people on the phone all the time. So it's visibly something that people are it's normalized. I think that's a really good point about the kind of context and the use of methods that makes sense to people. Whereas Kavita, I think what you were saying about, you know, the intimidating nature of certain methods, that's really important. That was, you know, and I think bearing in mind, you know, ours was a sample of men. Men are more likely to have access to a phone. They are more likely to use mobile phones through things like business. It allows a little bit more of an entry point. But certainly I think that definitely, you know, we immediately cut out anything that required data, anything that required screen time, because that is just not only inaccessible, but less familiar and more intimidating. It creates a power structure. So yeah, I mean, it's an amazing question, Joanna, and I think it would be great to have some kind of, I don't know, thinking forward, you know, reflections on these kind of different complexities that methods are not just about the research itself, but actually what methods work for different contexts, different forms of socialization and communication and culture.
Thanks, Joe. I like what you said earlier also about the pluralities in respondents and pluralities in methods, and that's something that I think ties in quite well with what you just said just now. Yeah, what about the other speakers? Did you see local contexts or cultures affect the successes or challenges in your research? Maybe Susie, if you want any comments or.
I think I'd agree with everything Joe said, particularly about phone use. I think I was more uncomfortable making that many phone calls than my participants were, because I'd send an initial email and they're like, oh yeah, just give me a ring now. And I thought, oh, I've got to psych myself up for making a phone call. I don't like the sound of my own voice at the best of times. So I found that actually, I think I found that part of my research easier. The thing that I was trying to mitigate in my research was because I was doing linguistic analysis and I was using critical discourse analysis, which is based, or my training is based in British journalism. I was really concerned that the analysis I was doing was reflective of my own frames of reference, my own background as a teacher of linguistics. And so what I was trying to find out through my interviews was whether what I was analyzing from the data in front of me was actually, my interpretation was that mirroring the intentions. And so I think the key limitation of my research was I didn't speak to people consuming the social media content and newspaper content in Kenya. So I was looking at I think it was more, are my cultural reference points and contexts impacting the validity of my data? So in speaking to people at institutional level, that was really helpful in that what I was picking out was mirroring what they were saying, but it's only a tiny part of a huge discussion, I think. So I think I can partly say that I was thinking about the context, but I think it's a tip of a very large iceberg, I think.
Thank you, Susie. That's really great. Thank you for your answers. And yeah, since we're 4 minutes nearing to 12 p.m., perhaps I would just ask one last question. So all of the research conducted in this panel mostly use mobile phone surveys, but we've also heard from Susie that we could also use social media data to generate a lot of great insights about the media landscape and possibly about other things. Twitter, for example, has been called by some as the pulse of the planet. in Indonesia, where I'm from, people go on Twitter to get the latest news or to get like the latest hot, what should I say, gossip, but like the hottest news. What is everyone discussing about? Everyone goes to Twitter to see what the issues are, right? So, Nicola, in your presentation, you talk about how a mobile phone survey can be used for policy making. I was wondering if I could just get some maybe comments from the panelists, or would social media data be something that you would consider perhaps as a source, for research, as a source of data to be used for research to generate insights for policy making? Maybe we could start with Nicola, and then Kavita, Joe, and Susie, just in the order of the presentation.
Point, Joanna, or interesting question. So I think for us, when it came to policy making, what was so clear and evident was that it was the type of data that was the main driver of the Bangladeshi government responding so quickly and so forcefully, and with coming in with these big support packages. I don't think that I don't think social media data could be used in this. It is not worthwhile, but for this purpose, for the government to be able to say, okay, who's suffering the most from COVID-19 pandemic, who's losing their livelihoods, who's got no credible data. It's not to say social media couldn't be a really interesting and important source of that data, but I think it would be a lot less convincing as a credible source of data, because it's not representative who is on Twitter. So I think there's definitely questions that we need to consider moving forward with that kind of data, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be using it. We just have to be able to answer all of those questions to make sure that it is credible data. Because at the end of the day, that is credible, and then what does it tell us? If you don't answer the first two questions, lots of interesting potential.
Yeah, so it's every data source for every type of research. I see. Yeah, what about Kavita? I know you have to go soon, but if you could maybe. Oh, okay. Sorry, Kavita, I have to leave. But thank you so much, Kavita, for your presentation and your insights. It's really, really insightful. Perhaps Joe and Susie, if you want to comment on that, could social media data, or maybe not beyond that, maybe text messages, just different forms of this kinds of data, can they be used for research and policy making, you think?
Absolutely. I completely agree with Nikki in terms of obviously just depending on what the questions are, depending on what we're thinking about. But I think in terms of thinking about my research, the research we're doing around masculinities and the constructions of masculinities, when thinking about the constructions and the reproductions of certain ideas, certain discourses, I think social media is a spectacularly interesting place to look at, because you see those public-facing discourses. It actually might be really interesting to then compare that to things like, where focus groups aren't maybe possible, or, we think about focus groups being those interactions that we're looking at, and interviews being the more kind of in-depth, hopefully the kind of more private. Actually, can social media help complicate that and give greater insight into that by showing us a little bit more about that public-facing reproduction of discourse? And certainly, not only do you see that, so you could look at how people talk about being men, people talk about sexual and reproductive health in those contexts in my research, but also I know in the past there's been really interesting stuff around social media being used for information for abortion-related care. So places like Marie Stopes, IPAS, IPPF, having social media spaces, platforms, Facebook pages, and all that kind of thing, where people can ask their questions and people can get responses. And that is really, really important data, because from that, you really get a sense of what is it that people are needing to know about, what's important for them. And you can start to track, what are the repeat kind of questions coming up that need to be maybe addressed in policy? Again, I completely agree with Nikki, it's a self-selecting source, social media. And I think there's still a long way to go before we see social media really democratized in a way that means that we could say feasibly, this could be representative. But I do think just the wealth and depth and breadth of what we can get from it is definitely not something I would ever turn my nose up to. I think really there's some amazing futures in terms of social media based data.
There are a lot of opportunities, it seems, but also a lot of challenges that come with them. What about Susie? Perhaps if you could maybe comment on that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some things that we can take from social media. And I've seen some really interesting studies done using digital ethnography, where you kind of have a researcher embedded within discussion groups and kind of monitoring what's going on. I think one of the things that I'm a bit more dubious about is the ethical constraints when looking at social media data, because, and especially I see this as a teacher of teenagers, people post stuff online sometimes without really thinking about where that might go. And so I think we have to be mindful as researchers about what we look at, how we look at it. I think there's certainly instances of people posting things online, not thinking that that's then a permanent record of something, that it might not actually reflect how they feel. It might be inflammatory statements. So I think for all its benefits, social media is a really interesting and complicated place. But in terms, I think it speaks to what you were saying, Nikki, about how valid it is as a form of data. Because with the idea of, the purpose of social media being to interact socially, you have quite a lot of emotive content that might not actually, it might bring up interesting insights, but it might not be what you're looking for in that sense. So I really liked working with social media. I liked working at it within the constraints of institutional level. I think had I started looking at personal accounts, it would have made the mining and analysis a lot more complicated. So I think that's something to be mindful of as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so definitely a lot of opportunities there in terms of data sources, but also a lot of challenges with the just the nature of the data that is produced on those mediums. Thank you everyone for the really great presentations. Thank you as well for the discussion. I wish I could still ask the 10 or more questions I have on my list, because all your presentations were just so engaging and interesting, but that would have to be for next time. Thank you so much for all the audience for your questions and insights. That's all for this session. There will be another session on remote research methods taking place tomorrow at the same time at 10 a.m. UK time. Hope to see you there as well. Thank you. Take care, everyone.